The fluorescent lights of the boardroom felt far more clinical and cold than the ones in the emergency department. Zara Jonathan stood with her hands clasped behind her back, her posture a rigid, undeniable echo of her 20 years in the Navy. She didn't look like a woman being forced into the sunset of her career. She looked like a commander standing on the bridge of a ship during a gale. Across the mahogany table, Harold Vance, the hospital board chairman, leaned back in his leather chair. He adjusted his silk tie, his face reddening with the kind of agitation that usually preceded a lecture on corporate synergy. Beside him stood Dr. Gerald, the chief of orthopedics, who was currently pointing a pen toward a stack of incident reports as if they were evidence in a capital murder trial. "It's about the culture, Zara," Vance said, his voice straining for a paternal tone that fell flat against the sterile walls. "Metropolitan General isn't a combat zone. We've had 3 complaints this month alone. You bypassed Dr. Gerald's direct orders on the Miller case to initiate a preemptive stabilization. This isn't the USS Comfort. We have protocols. We have hierarchies. We have a patient who is still alive because I didn't wait 20 minutes for a signature while he was hemorrhaging internally," Zara replied, her voice a calm, low vibration that made the air in the room feel heavier. She didn't blink. Her eyes, serious and alert, remained fixed on Vance. Dr. Gerald scoffed, his mouth opening in an aggressive, sharp burst of frustration. "It was insubordination, plain and simple. You took a scalpel to a patient without a surgeon present. You're a nurse, Jonathan. A highly skilled one, sure, but you need to know your lane. This battlefield mentality of yours is a liability to the board." Zara looked at the 2 men, the bureaucrats and the egoists who viewed hospital beds as line items and seniority as a shield against common sense. She felt the familiar sting of the defiance label they had tried to pin on her since her first day. She had endured the disrespect, the sidelining, and the quiet whispers in the break rooms, but her spirit remained grounded. She wasn't uncooperative, she was just right. "I've spent my life in places where the lane is whatever keeps the boy on the gurney breathing," she said softly. "If that's a liability here, then perhaps you're right. Perhaps I don't fit your culture." Vance sighed, sliding a folder across the table. "We've accelerated the paperwork. Your retirement is effective Friday at 5 p.m. We appreciate your service, Lieutenant Commander, but Metropolitan needs team players, not mavericks." Zara didn't reach for the folder. She turned slightly, her gaze drifting toward the window. Far off in the distance, past the city skyline, the first wisps of a thick, unnatural fog were beginning to roll in from the coast. A strange, orange glow was beginning to pulse against the gray horizon, distant, rhythmic, and ominous. "You have 5 days left," Gerald added, his tone dismissive as he turned back to his tablet. "Try to spend them following the rules for once." Zara didn't answer. She was already mid-movement, her boots clicking with a disciplined cadence as she headed toward the door. She didn't look confused by the dismissal. She looked focused. The warrior poet in her could sense the atmospheric pressure changing. The rookie staff might have been worried about the chairman's mood, but Zara was watching the horizon. She walked out of the boardroom and toward the ER, her scrubs simple and blue, her hair pulled back into a tight, professional knot. She knew the politics were over. The storm was coming, and when it hit, Vance and Gerald would find out that the woman they had just forced to retire was the only thing standing between their hospital and a total collapse. Toby was 23, 3 months out of his paramedic certification, and currently possessed by the kind of jittery energy that comes from 3 energy drinks and a profound desire to be noticed. He stood near the ambulance bay doors, snapping his latex gloves on and off, watching the fog thicken into a wall of gray soup outside. The news had just flashed across the scanners. A massive pileup on the I-95 involving dozens of vehicles, including a fuel tanker and 2 commuter buses. The ER was a hive of frantic, uncoordinated movement. Dr. Gerald was shouting for more residents, and the charge nurse was arguing with a tech about a malfunctioning heart monitor. Amidst the noise, Toby's eyes were drawn to the far corner of the trauma ward. Zara Jonathan was moving. She wasn't running. She wasn't shouting. But the speed at which she was operating made Toby's head spin. He watched as she cleared a 3-foot perimeter around the main trauma bay, sliding heavy equipment into precise, 45-degree angles. She wasn't just setting up, she was fortifying. The young medic, his face highlighted by the red emergency strobes, stares in disbelief as Zara preps the bay. Nurse Jonathan? Toby stammered, stepping toward her. The first rigs are still 10 minutes out. Dr. Gerald said we shouldn't open the sterile kits until the triage officer confirms the count. Zara didn't look up, but Toby felt the weight of her focus shift toward him. Her hands were a blur, opening drawers, checking the seals on chest tubes, and lining up intubation kits with a mechanical, rhythmic snap. 10 minutes is the estimate for the first ambulance. Toby, she said, her voice a low, steady anchor in the room. In this fog, the first civilian walk-ins will be at the door in 3. We aren't waiting for a count. We're preparing for a flood. Toby watched her hands. They didn't shake. She took a roll of white athletic tape and tore off 12 identical strips, sticking them to the edge of the metal supply cart. She then checked the pressure on the wall-mounted oxygen, her movements so economical they looked choreographed. It reminded Toby of a video he'd seen of a pit crew during a high-stakes race, or better yet, a deckhand on a carrier. The kits stay closed until needed, she added, her eyes finally meeting his. They were sharp, alert, and entirely devoid of the panic currently vibrating through the rest of the staff. But the drawers stay unlocked. We don't hunt for tools while someone is bleeding out. Seconds are the only currency we have tonight. And I don't plan on being poor. Toby felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He realized then that while the senior doctors were busy debating protocols in the hallway, Zara was already at war. She had turned her station into a red circle, a zone of absolute readiness. He looked at the other nurses, who were still fumbling with clipboards, then back at Zara. She was standing perfectly still now, her hands resting at her sides, her posture grounded and steady. She was staring at the bay doors with a look of terrifying anticipation. Toby, she said, not looking at him, get the portable suction units. Line them up by the triage desk. Not where the manual says they go. Put them where the paramedics will hit them first when they run through those doors. Yes, ma'am, Toby said, his voice cracking slightly. He didn't ask why. He didn't check with Dr. Gerald. For the first time since he'd started his rotation, he realized he wasn't looking at a difficult retiree. He was looking at a master of the environment. A distant, low moan echoed through the parking lot, the first of many sirens, wailing like a banshee through the fog. The massive pileup had arrived. Toby took a breath, centered himself, and followed the woman who was already 5 steps ahead of the disaster. The automatic doors hissed open and stayed open, surrendered to the sheer volume of the incoming tide. The fog followed the gurneys inside, a cold, gray vapor that smelled of gasoline, burnt rubber, and iron. It was the sound that hit first, a wall of discordant noise, the high-pitched wail of terrified children, the rhythmic thud of running boots, and the frantic, overlapping reports of paramedics shouting for more hands. In the center of the intake lobby, the civilian staff was already fracturing. Dr. Gerald was standing in the middle of the aisle, his hands raised in a gesture of overwhelmed frustration, shouting for the registration clerks to get names and insurance information. It was a bureaucratic response to a kinetic disaster, and it was failing. Zara Jonathan stepped into the breach. She didn't go to a computer. She reached into her scrub pocket and pulled out a thick, black permanent marker. Toby, on me, she commanded. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a resonant, metallic edge that cut through the screaming. A young man was wheeled in, his chest heaving, his face a mask of road rash and glass shards. Before the paramedic could even finish his report, Zara was there. She didn't look at a clipboard. She checked the man's carotid pulse with 2 fingers of her left hand, while her right hand moved with the precision of a calligrapher. In bold, unmistakable ink, she wrote a 1 directly onto the man's forehead, followed by a C for chest and a 12-14 time stamp. Trauma Bay 1. Go, she barked. The paramedic blinked, staring at the number on the patient's skin. Wait, you just go. She moved to the next gurney. A woman, conscious but pale, clutching a mangled arm. Zara's eyes did a 3-second sweep, skin color, breathing rate, mental status. A 2 went on the woman's forehead. Bay 4. Elevate and wait. Jonathan, what the hell are you doing? Dr. Gerald's voice rose above the din as he stormed over, his face flushed with indignation. He pointed an aggressive finger at the black ink on the elderly man Zara was currently marking. This is a hospital, not a shipyard. You are defacing patients. We use color-coded wristbands. There is a protocol for. The wristbands get lost in the blood, Dr. Gerald, Zara said, not even looking up as she marked a 3 on a teenager with a broken leg. and the clipboards get swapped when the gurneys move. In a mass casualty event, the patient is the chart. She stood up, her posture steady and grounded while the world around her seemed to spin on a broken axis. She looked Gerald in the eye, the serious, alert gaze of a veteran who had seen these halls filled with more bodies than he had seen in his worst nightmares. You can worry about the paperwork, or you can worry about the pulse. Pick one. Gerald opened his mouth to shout, to exert the authority that was rapidly evaporating. But his words were drowned out by a fresh wave of sirens. The lobby was now a sea of red and blue strobes reflecting off the white floor. Zara ignored him. She turned back to the doors, her marker ready. She was building a triage wall, a human assembly line where the most critical cases were filtered out before they could clog the system. The young medic, Toby, watched her from the periphery, his shock slowly turning into a focused, frantic imitation of her movements. He saw the nurses whispering, the doctors looking on in a mix of horror and awe, but he also saw something else. The chaos was beginning to have a shape. For 20 years, Zara had lived by the rule that in the middle of the storm, simplicity is the only thing that survives. The black numbers on the foreheads were ugly, they were military, and they were a direct violation of every civilian culture Vance had bragged about. But as the first one was rushed into surgery, and the threes were funneled into the waiting area, the triage wall held. Zara Jonathan was no longer just a nurse in blue scrubs. She was the architect of the only survival plan Metropolitan General had left. The rhythmic hiss of the hospital's automatic doors began to morph, the sound deepening into the roar of heavy surf and the relentless, mechanical groan of a ship fighting a losing battle against the Atlantic. Zara blinked, and for a fleeting second, the sterile white tiling of Metropolitan General dissolved into the wet, swaying steel of the USS Comfort. It was 2015, and the world was screaming. A Category 5 hurricane had turned the Caribbean into a churning graveyard, and the hospital ship was the only light left in the dark. Zara, a lieutenant then, stood in the center of a triage deck that was pitching at a 20-degree angle. Rain and seawater lashed the open bay, mixing with the blood of 80 survivors who had been plucked from the wreckage of a coastal village. "Commander, we're losing pressure in Bay 3. A corpsman had shouted, his voice nearly drowned out by the thunder. Zara hadn't hesitated. She didn't have the luxury of a quiet boardroom or a sterilized orthopedic suite. She had moved across the slick, bucking floor with the sea legs of a woman who had spent half her life on the water. She remembered the weight of a young boy in her arms, his skin the color of ash, his breathing a shallow, ragged whistle. There were no senior surgeons available. They were all trapped in the main ORs. There was only the storm, the dying boy, and the shadow of the trident pinned to her soul. She had knelt in 6 inches of rising seawater, her hands steady despite the ship's violent shuddering. She had performed a field-expedient intubation while the lights flickered and died, guided only by the rhythmic pulse of a handheld tactical light held between her teeth. She hadn't flinched when a rogue wave slammed a loose gurney against her hip, bruising her bone deep. She hadn't flinched when the screams reached a pitch that would have broken a civilian's mind. In the Navy, they taught you that chaos was just data you hadn't organized yet. They taught you that blood was just a leak that needed a plug. But more than that, the Comfort had taught her that the only thing more dangerous than a storm was a leader who lost their nerve. She had watched a seasoned captain freeze that night, his eyes glazing over as the casualty count climbed into the hundreds. Zara had stepped over him, literally and figuratively, and taken the deck. She had saved 42 lives before the sun rose over the flattened remains of the coast. That was the night she realized she was a warrior poet, someone who could recite the clinical requirements of a trauma rest while the world burned around her. It was also the night she realized that policy was a secondary concern to a pulse. The sharp, abrasive beep of a malfunctioning heart monitor in the Metropolitan lobby snapped the tether to the past. The salt spray evaporated, replaced by the smell of industrial disinfectant and the panicked shouting of Dr. Gerald. Zara looked down at her hands. They were resting on the edge of a gurney, relaxed and ready. She looked at the blood on her light blue scrubs, a dark, jagged bloom that would have sent a civilian nurse into shock. To Zara, it was just a map of where the work began. She turned her head slightly, catching her reflection in the glass of the trauma doors. The middle-aged woman staring back didn't look like a retiree. She looked like the ghost of the Comfort, a woman who had survived the Atlantic and wasn't about to be sunk by a 50-car pileup or a board chairman with a silk tie. "Toby," she said, her voice dropping into that low command frequency that she'd used on the deck of the ship. "The next 3 gurneys are yours. Stop looking at the blood and start looking at the airway. The storm is already here. You might as well learn how to swim." The ER was a scene of controlled, bloody geometry, a masterpiece of battlefield logic being written in real time. But to Harold Vance, it looked like a riot. The hospital board chairman burst through the double doors, his face a mottled shade of violet that clashed violently with his silk tie. He wasn't looking at the lives being saved. He was looking at the black permanent marker numbers on the foreheads of the patients and the unauthorized rearrangement of the trauma bays. "Jonathan, stop this madness right now." Vance's voice cracked as he shouted over the din of a departing gurney. He marched into the center of the triage zone, nearly colliding with a medic who was rushing a priority 1 into surgery. Zara didn't stop. She was kneeling beside a woman with a crushed pelvis, her hands applying steady, rhythmic pressure to a femoral bleed. "Toby, more gauze. Secure the pressure dressing and prep for a secondary survey," she commanded, her voice a calm, low-frequency hum that ignored Vance entirely. Vance grabbed Zara by the shoulder, a move that would have gotten him flattened on the deck of the Comfort. Zara didn't strike him, but she shifted her weight, a subtle movement of grounded authority that forced his hand to slip. She looked up, her expression serious, alert, and terrifyingly cold. "Chairman, you are obstructing a life-saving procedure," she said. It wasn't a plea, it was a statement of fact. "I am stopping a liability." Vance screamed, pointing an aggressive finger at the triage board she had improvised on the wall. "You have no authority to implement military protocols in a civilian facility. You are writing on people's skin like they're livestock. Dr. Gerald has already informed me of your defiance. This is over. You are terminated, effective immediately. Get out of my hospital." The room went momentarily quiet. The younger nurses paused, their eyes darting between the man with the power to sign checks and the woman with the power to stop bleeding. Dr. Gerald stood in the background, arms crossed, looking vindicated. Zara stood up slowly, her simple blue scrubs stained with the reality of the 50-car pileup. She didn't look like a woman who had just lost her job. She looked like a commander whose ship was being sabotaged from within. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice dropping an octave, echoing with the stoic resilience of a veteran. "Right now, there is a 4-mile stretch of highway that looks like a war zone. We have 40 units out there and only 12 bays in here. If I stop, the funnel clogs. If the funnel clogs, the people in the hallway start dying. Do you want to be the one to explain to the press why you fired the only person in this building who knows how to run a mass casualty event? Don't you threaten me," Vance hissed, his ego blinding him to the gurney being wheeled in behind him. "You're a nurse being forced to retire. You're a footnote. Security." At that moment, the automatic doors hissed open again. This time, it wasn't an ambulance crew. It was Fire Chief Ray Torres and Captain Owen Marshall, their gear covered in soot and road grime. They were carrying a specialized backboard, their faces etched with a grim, urgent desperation. "We need a triage lead," Chief Torres roared, his eyes scanning the chaotic lobby. He ignored Vance and Gerald entirely, his gaze locking onto the middle-aged black woman with the black marker in her hand and the steady, grounded posture. He recognized the energy immediately. It was the same energy he'd seen in combat medics in the Middle East. "Nurse Jonathan," Torres said, stepping past the chairman. "We've got a critical entrapment victim coming in. High-velocity impact. We need the Black Zone protocol. Are you ready?" Zara didn't look at Vance. She didn't look at the termination folder he was still clutching. She looked at the chief. "Bay 1 is prepped. Toby, move the portable suction. Now." She turned her back on the board chairman, her mid-movement urgency signaling that the politics were officially dead. Vance stood paralyzed, his mouth open mid-shout, finally realizing that in this storm, his title was worthless. The difficult nurse was the only anchor left, and the Marines and the fire crews knew exactly who was in command. Zara moved toward the doors, the warrior poet finally embracing the clarity of the mission. The heavy double doors of the ambulance bay didn't just open. They were slammed aside by the sheer force of Fire Chief Ray Torres and Captain Owen Marshall. They were hauling a specialized tactical backboard, their turnout gear slick with a mixture of hydraulic fluid and rain. Between them lay a young police officer, his uniform shredded, his face an ashen mask of shock. The air around them vibrated with the frantic, high-pitched whistle of a tension pneumothorax, the sound of a lung collapsing and a heart being displaced by trapped air. "Clear the way," Marshall roared, his voice a blunt instrument that sent the administrative staff scattering like dry leaves. Harold Vance, still reeling from Zara's defiance, tried to step into their path. "Chief, you need to follow the intake protocol. Dr. Gerald is the chief of." Ray Torres didn't even slow down. He used his shoulder to bump Vance aside, his eyes locked onto Zara Jonathan. "Nurse, he's crashing. Bilateral chest trauma. We've got midline shift. We're in the black zone, Zara. Tell me you still know how to do this." The room seemed to contract. The black zone wasn't a civilian medical term. It was a military designation for a patient so close to death that traditional triage protocols were abandoned for immediate, aggressive battlefield intervention. Dr. Gerald stepped forward, his face pale. "Wait, you can't. Black zone isn't a recognized hospital status. We need an X-ray. We need a surgical consult. We need a needle," Zara interrupted, her voice a snap of cold iron. She moved before the gurney even stopped, her mid-movement urgency a blur of blue scrubs and disciplined focus. She didn't look for a doctor's permission or a board member's signature. She grabbed a large-bore decompression needle from the kit she had prepped with battlefield speed only 20 minutes earlier. "Marshall, hold his head." "Torres, pressure on the femoral bleed," Zara commanded. The two veterans obeyed instantly, their movements synchronized with hers in a way they never would be with Gerald or Vance. They recognized the energy, the stoic resilience of a commander who had seen the worst the world had to offer and refused to blink. Zara's fingers flew over the officer's chest, counting the ribs with a mechanical precision that silenced the room. She found the second intercostal space, the needle glinting under the red emergency strobes. "Jonathan, stop," Gerald shouted, his voice high and panicked. "That's a surgical procedure. You'll be arrested. You're retired." Zara didn't even twitch. She looked at the dying officer, then up at Marshall. For a heartbeat, the ghost of the USS Comfort was visible in her eyes. The warrior poet who knew that the only thing that mattered was the life under her hands. "His heart is being crushed." "Doctor," she said, her voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register. "If I wait for you to find your nerve, he's a memory." "Captain, hold him steady." Marshall leaned in, his jaw set. "Do it, Cobra." The use of the tactical call sign, a remnant from a joint mission years ago, sent a jolt through the room. The young medic, Toby, watched with wide-eyed realization, his hands trembling as he held the portable suction unit. He realized then that the difficult retiree wasn't just a nurse. She was the only person in the building who spoke the language of the dying. Zara leaned over the patient, her posture steady and grounded. The arrogant doctors and the agitated chairman were now just background noise, as irrelevant as the fog outside. She was back on the swaying deck of the ship, back in the storm where the only protocol was survival. With a single decisive movement, she drove the needle home. The hiss of escaping air was the loudest sound in the room, a life-giving whistle that signaled the pressure was equalizing. The officer's chest rose in a jagged, desperate gasp for air. His heart rate, which had been a frantic, dying flutter on the monitor, began to stabilize into a rhythmic, fighting thud. Zara didn't celebrate. She didn't even look at Vance. She just pulled the needle back and began to secure the site. "Toby, check his bilateral breath sounds. Marshall, get him 201. Tell them the commander sent him." She stood up, her face a mask of serious, alert defiance. The board chairman and the chief of orthopedics stood paralyzed in the hallway. Two men who had spent their careers building walls of paper, finally realizing they were standing in the presence of someone who had spent hers tearing them down. Zara Jonathan wasn't just a retiree. She was the mission. The hallway was no longer a corridor. It was a bottleneck of human suffering, slick with rainwater and the copper scent of trauma. The red emergency lights continued their rhythmic, bloody pulse, casting long, jagged shadows against the white linoleum. In the center of this chaos, a gurney carrying a young mother, the driver of one of the commuter buses, came to a screeching halt as her monitors flatlined into a single, terrifying tone. "She's in VFib. I'm losing her," Toby shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of the moment. He began chest compressions right there in the middle of the hallway, the gurney rocking violently under his weight. Dr. Gerald appeared from the side, his face pale and sweating. "We have to get her to a sterile environment." Move her to her floor. She won't make the elevator, Dr. Zara said. Her voice was a low, vibrating chord of command that anchored the panicking staff. She didn't look at Gerald. She was already slicing the situation, identifying the equipment she needed from the crash cart she had prepped with battlefield speed. You can't do a thoracotomy in a hallway, Gerald screamed, his mouth open in an aggressive, frantic burst of panic. He pointed a shaking finger at the tray Zara was laying out on the foot of the gurney. It's a violation of every surgical protocol we have. The infection risk alone. The risk is she dies in the next 60 seconds because her heart is surrounded by a clotted hematoma, Zara countered. She didn't flinch. She stood grounded, a middle-aged black woman in blood-stained blue scrubs who looked more like a general than a retiree. Step back, Dr. Gerald. Or pick up a suction wand and make yourself useful. Gerald froze, stunned into a temporary, humiliated silence. He had spent his career behind desks and in scheduled suites, and the raw, brutal reality of the black zone had left him hollow. Zara didn't wait for his permission. She moved with a mechanical, rhythmic precision that looked like a dance. She didn't have a surgical team. She had Toby. She didn't have a sterile theater. She had a hallway lit by ambulance strobes. With a steady hand, she took a scalpel and made a swift, lateral incision between the ribs, the clamshell technique she had mastered on the deck of the Comfort while the Atlantic tried to swallow her whole. Zara, center focus, performs the intervention with steady hands while Dr. Gerald watches from the background, his expression one of pure shock. The sound of the ribs being spread was sharp, a mechanical snap that made the surrounding nurses gasp. Zara reached in. Her hands, smooth and brown and steady, disappeared into the woman's chest cavity. This was the warrior poet's ultimate defiance, the refusal to let the bureaucracy of a hospital board dictate the terms of a human life. Toby suction. Now she whispered. She felt the heart, a heavy, still weight in her palm. She cleared the clotted blood, her fingers finding the rhythmic pump she needed to manually restart the life within. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the sound of the fog-muffled sirens outside. Then she felt it, a faint, fluttering thud against her fingertips. Then another, stronger. She's back, Toby breathed, tears blurring his vision as the monitor's flatline broke into a jagged, beautiful sinus rhythm. Zara didn't celebrate. She didn't look up for applause. She kept her hands inside the woman's chest, maintaining the internal pressure as the gurney began to move again. She looked at Dr. Gerald, who was standing back against the wall, his mouth still open, his arrogant authority completely disintegrated. "4 is ready for you now, Doctor," Zara said, her voice devoid of heat but heavy with the weight of her experience. "I've stabilized the pump. All you have to do is close." She walked with the gurney, her posture steady, her mid-movement urgency never faltering. She was the center focus of the entire floor, a woman who had been forced to retire because she was difficult, but who was now the only reason the hospital hadn't collapsed into a morgue. As the elevator doors closed on her and the patient, the hallway remained silent. The civilian staff finally realizing that the difficult nurse was the only master of the storm they had ever met. The first gray fingers of dawn finally began to pull the fog away from the hospital windows, revealing the skeletal remains of the pileup still tangled on the distant highway. Inside Metropolitan General, the screaming sirens had been replaced by a heavy, ringing silence that felt almost thick enough to touch. The red emergency lights had finally flickered off, and the standard fluorescents buzzed back to life, exposing the true cost of the night. The floors were littered with discarded gauze, empty saline bags, and the black ink numbers that still marked the foreheads of the survivors. In the center of the trauma bay, the senior doctors were ghosts of their former selves. Dr. Paul Gerald sat on a rolling stool, his head in his hands. His pristine white coat, now a map of coffee stains and salt water. He looked exhausted, his arrogance stripped away by 12 hours of a reality he hadn't been prepared to face. Across the room, even Harold Vance stood leaning against a blood-streaked wall, his silk tie loosened and his expensive leather shoes scuffed beyond repair. They were men who had been humbled not by a person, but by the sheer, unyielding competence of a woman they had tried to erase. Zara Jonathan, however, was still standing. Her blue scrubs were a darker shade of navy from the moisture and the work, but her posture remained as steady and grounded as it had been when the first orange glow hit the horizon. She moved to the bedside of her last patient, the young officer she had decompressed in the hallway, and checked his vitals with a mechanical, rhythmic precision. Her hands, the hands of a warrior poet, didn't shake as she adjusted his drip. She wasn't looking for a thank you or a reprieve. She was simply finishing the mission. Stable, she whispered, the word carrying a resonant, metallic edge that seemed to anchor the quiet room. Toby, the young medic, stood at the foot of the bed. He was shaking from a combination of adrenaline withdrawal and awe, his eyes fixed on Zara as if she were a figure from a legend. He had watched her reorganize a failing system, perform battlefield surgery in a corridor, and stare down the most powerful men in the building without blinking. He realized now that the defiance Vance had complained about wasn't a flaw, it was a shield. "You should sit down, Commander," Toby said, his voice cracking with a newfound realization of who she truly was. Zara finally turned her head, her serious, alert gaze softening just a fraction as she looked at the boy she had trained in the heat of a slaughter. She saw the way the rest of the staff was looking at her, the nurses who were no longer whispering, but watching her with a silent, profound respect. "The Navy taught me that you don't sit until the deck is clear, Toby," she replied, her voice low and steady. She looked past the young medic toward the window, where the sun was finally cresting the horizon. For the first time in months, the weight of the forced retirement didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a misunderstanding that had finally been corrected by the storm. She had traded her rifle for a stethoscope years ago, but as the sun rose over a hospital full of people who were still breathing because she had refused to back down, Zara Jonathan knew she wasn't finished. The rookie persona was dead, and the woman who had survived the comfort was the only one left standing in the light. The aftermath of the storm was not measured in silence, but in the low, rhythmic hum of a hospital that had found its pulse again. 3 days after the pileup, the boardroom of Metropolitan General felt vastly different. The cold, clinical air had been replaced by a heavy sense of reckoning. Harold Vance sat at the head of the mahogany table, but the silk tie was gone, and his face was no longer a mask of paternal authority. Beside him, Dr. Paul Gerald looked smaller, his aggressive pointing replaced by a hollow stare directed at the floor. They were facing a full assembly of the hospital board, and for the first time, the culture Vance had bragged about was being scrutinized through the lens of a disaster that nearly broke them. "The internal review is conclusive," a senior board member stated, her voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. "Your decision to ignore the city's emergency warnings, combined with the embezzlement of funds earmarked for security upgrades, led to a systemic failure that almost cost dozens of lives. If not for the unauthorized intervention of a single nurse, this hospital would be facing a catastrophic class action suit today." Vance attempted to stand, his mouth opening for one last burst of agitation, but the board member cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Your resignation is effective immediately, Harold. And Dr. Gerald, you will be placed on administrative leave pending a review of your clinical conduct during the crisis." As they were ushered out, 2 men who had spent their careers building walls of paper, a side door opened. Zara Jonathan walked in. She wore her simple blue scrubs, her posture steady and grounded, showing the same disciplined, serious expression she had worn in the heat of the black zone. The board stood as she approached, not out of protocol, but out of a profound, burgeoning respect. The chairwoman leaned forward, her eyes searching the face of the woman they had nearly discarded. "Lieutenant Commander, the city's first responders, Chief Torres and Captain Marshall, have spent the last 48 hours explaining why we are fools for letting you go." She slid a new contract across the table. "It wasn't a retirement notice. We are creating a new position, Chief of Disaster Medicine. We need someone who doesn't wait for a signature while the world is burning. We need someone who can bridge the gap between the warrior and the healer." Zara didn't look at the salary or the title. She looked at the young medic, Toby, who was standing by the door, waiting for her next command. She saw the red circle she had drawn in the lobby and realized the mission wasn't over. The defiance Vance had hated was exactly what the city needed to survive the next storm. "I have conditions," Zara said, her voice a low, resonant chord of command that anchored the room. "The first is that the bridge program begins Monday. No more silos between the military medics and the civilian staff." "Granted," the chairwoman replied. Zara Jonathan picked up the pen. She wasn't a footnote or a difficult retiree anymore. She was the architect of a new era. As she signed her name, she felt the last echoes of the USS Comfort settle into a quiet, powerful peace. The commander had returned, and this time She wasn't hiding the shadow she carried. She was using it to lead the way into the light.